Welcome to First in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, the Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, the author of Wounds and 30 Events That Shaped the Church and 60 People Who Shaped the Church and about 30 novels. And coming up in May, my portion of the Harbingers, known as The Girl, Harbinger series.
Girl.
Yeah.
Exciting. Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining us this week. We are talking about spirituality in fiction with Easter fast approaching, but before we do that, as per usual, we've got a publishing term for the day. So, Pops, what do you have for us today?
Well, it's a term you're likely to hear around writers' conferences and other groups of writers sitting around shooting the breeze, and it's the phrase legacy publisher. I should say the term legacy publisher. With the advent of a lot of self-publishing, and prior to that, vanity press, indie press, all of those things, we're finding some of these terms to be a little more important. And a legacy publisher is the same thing as a traditional publisher. That is, a legacy publisher is somebody who's going to offer a contract, is going to, at their expense, give an advance, they're going to promote the book, they're going to provide the editing. It's just the old school way of doing things, both for physical books and then, of course, new school way of doing things for ebooks, but it's still done by something like Simon & Schuster or Zondervan or Random House, that sort of thing. By the way, do you know why Random House is called Random House?
I believe because it published things randomly.
That's right.
Is that correct? Just
yep, when Bennett Cerf and his buddy started Random House after leaving another publisher, they published books at random. They didn't know what they're going to publish next, so it became Random House. Now, big house with that. So it's a legacy publisher and traditional publishing, really the same thing. Legacy just means going back in time. Traditional is the old way of doing it, and still in many ways the preferred way of doing things. So that's our publishing term for the day.
Excellent. Legacy publishing. So it makes me think of Legacy in Magic the Gathering, which is pretty much all the cards that you can play. So that's my nerd. That's it. Maybe I should start doing a Magic the Gathering term of the day so that I can nerd up our listeners and then maybe get some new listeners. I'm sure that would be a very interesting crowd to attract. But we are talking about spirituality and fiction today. We got fiction. Got Easter right around the corner coming up this weekend. And so we wanted to tackle this subject that's often, I think, misunderstood and often overlooked, especially in the aspect of character development. We tend to think of our characters, their personality traits. I encourage my students to think of their characters physically. What is their physical body like, their ailments, and all of that. But we also need to kind of explore the spirituality of our characters. Now, that doesn't mean that your character is necessarily going to be Christian or Buddhist or Islamic, but they could, subscribe to the theory of karma. They could be an atheist, which I think the lack of spirituality in some ways is kind of a spiritual aspect of a character as well. Everybody believes in something, and some people believe in nothing. And that may sound kind of contradictory, but if you kind of think about it, believing in nothing is still believing in something. Does that make any sense? I feel like I'm kind of...
Yeah, it does, and interesting you should bring that up because this is National Atheist Day. They chose April Fool's Day to celebrate being an atheist, and it's probably some bad marketing choices there and all of that. But nonetheless, it's National Atheist Day, and someone wants to find an atheist, and I used to be an atheist, so I don't mind poking a little fun at them. But someone defined an atheist as somebody who shakes his fist in the face of a God he doesn't believe in. But you're right, sometimes an absence of spirituality, somebody who is the uber skeptic and denies belief in anything that's intangible, that in itself is a chosen belief system. And in our broad terminology today, because we're not talking about a particular faith, but in our broad terminology today, atheism would fit that. That's part of the spiritual aspect of an atheist. Though probably technically we should say they're striving for no spiritual aspect, but it nonetheless is a decision.
Yeah, and I kind of want to make that point clear that Not developing the spirituality of your character can be a pretty big downfall. It may be important to note that we are coming from a Christian perspective, myself especially, and but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking only about Christian fiction. Quite the contrary, actually. But even in writing Christian fiction, you're going to have your characters interacting with non-Christians, people of other faiths, and that can create a lot of tension, and it can be kind of a great place for your fiction to go and explore some spiritual themes and kind of transcend just the normal conflicts of space and time and saving the world, etc. But there can be that internal struggle within a person when they're struggling with their faith, when they're wrestling with that faith, or trying to renew that faith. So lots of stuff there to kind of consider.
Yeah, and getting that big picture, I think, is important. I usually teach that people have four aspects about them as far as writing goes. Some of the ones are very easy to recognize. We talk about a person's physicality. So there are those who are very good about describing how tall they are and the color of their hair and so on, and whether they're big and brawny or they're scrawny, whatever it might be, male, female. There's a physical aspect, and sooner or later a novelist is going to talk about physical aspects. But then there is also a mental aspect. Are they sharp? Are they a little slow? Are they highly educated? Do they think they're smarter than they are? There's this whole mental thing. There's an emotional aspect. An emotion is normally described with physical feelings, physical descriptions, but there's that emotional, happy, sad, bipolar, whatever it might be that your character is going through. But there's, I believe, always a spiritual aspect, whether it is a major portion of the character's makeup or a minor portion, but there's always something there that's a little less tangible and doesn't fit those other three areas. And that, I think, Aaron, is why we're using such broad terms here, because we do live in a very faith-filled world. That is, there's a lot of different faiths. And for me, from where I live now in Central California, I can take a fairly short walk, and in that short walk, I will encounter a place where Muslims meet, Hindus meet, Sikhs is from India, and there many of them have relocated here in Central California. It's kind of like Hinduism, but it's a different leader in it, so there's some connection there. But Sikhs, I passed them, a Catholic nunnery, a regular Catholic church, two flavors of Baptists, and a community church. And I can walk all of that and encounter all of those and not break a sweat. And that's just in my neighborhood. So if we go to the city, well, it's even more than that. So it is part of the human situation.
You know, I like that you say two flavors of Baptist churches. I've got three churches near where I live, just in our little community alone, and it's a pretty tiny community. And all of them stemmed from the same church originally, and there were a couple church splits, and so now we've got three. Actually, we might be up to four now of these churches just within my small neck of the woods here, all coming from the same parent church, if you will. And so it's interesting that even within particular denominations, particular faiths, there are offshoots, and knowing about that is kind of important. I'm reminded of the old Emo Phillips routine, where he sees a man with a horse face standing on a bridge ready to jump off, and he says, "Why the long face?" And then he proceeds to say, "Well, don't you believe in God? You can't kill yourself. Don't you believe in God?" "Yes, I do." "Well, so do I." "Are you Catholic or Protestant?" "Well, I'm Protestant." "Me too." "Are you, Baptist or Pentecostal?" "I'm Baptist." "Me too." "Are you Northern Baptist or Southern Baptist?" "I'm Northern Baptist." "That's great. Me too." "Are you Northern Baptist of 1812 or Northern Baptist of 1597? And he said, "I'm Northern Baptist of 1597. So I said, "Die, heretic," and I pushed him off the bridge.
Yeah, that thing runs about 15 minutes, as I recall.
I was trying to do the shortened version because it's only an hour podcast, so we gotta be wary of
It's
time.
a very long joke.
If you
And
get a chance,
there have been some great writers that have touched on these things, all from different faith approaches. I'm thinking of Harry Kimmelman, who I used to read a lot. He wrote the Rabbi Small series, and he wrote from the perspective of a conservative rabbi. Now, see, I have to explain that, and that's one of the things we want to get at here, is the need to understand which group you're talking about, because the mistakes can make you look very bad and very ignorant. Judaism in the United States has three basic categories. There's the very conservative, and they're called the Orthodox. There's a less stringent group called conservatives, usually, and then there's Reformed, which is probably the least strict of the group, and so he's sort of in the middle of that. And so they keep some kosher things in the kitchen and stuff like that, but there's not real extreme on either end with that. And he ends up solving murders from his work with the synagogue that he's at and the people, and he's good friends with the police chief, who's a Catholic, and that's what creates some of the tension. And so he did a whole series of books like that, and it was very educational for me. I loved it. But he also made mistakes about what Christians believe, and so he would talk about that, and often he would be wrong, or at least not quite on the mark. And so that's one of the things we'll probably talk a little bit more about. That I think of John Grisham, his book The Testament. Now, he's always remembered for writing legal thrillers, and that's still pretty much what he does. But he is a Christian man, but he doesn't write Christian novels. He'll tell you he's a Christian who writes novels, but not a Christian novelist. And so when you read his stuff, there's lots of times you wouldn't get a clue that he had those kinds of thinkings, those kind of leanings. But he did one book called The Testament where he sort of let some of that fly a little bit before going back to some of his regular stuff. So you can go all the way through all of Morris West doing the Roman Catholic persuasion. When I was in school, we had to read Siddhartha, which had to do with Buddhism. That was part of our curriculum. So it doesn't matter where you're starting from, you're going to see that plays a role in the lives of characters. And the people of the faith can either be good guys or bad guys. They're going to be protagonists or antagonists, depending on their nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an important point that you make about being accurate, and that was one of the points that I wanted to touch on, is the importance of research. Really what we're talking about here is there needs to be some diversity between your characters. If you're a Christian and you write only about Christians, that seems very far-fetched. I can't think of really any Christians who don't interact with some non-Christians on any given day, or some Islamic, or people who are Buddhists. Again, like in a big city of yours, like yours, there's going to be faiths of all sorts all across, and so there's going to be some interactions with people of different faiths. And to be accurate, what we talk about in the writing business is called writing the other, and it kind of covers this idea of a white person writing about African American, or vice versa, or a culture that's not yours, a gender that's not yours, a guy writing from the point of view of a female. You want to make sure that you get it right in any situation so that you're not being offensive. It's one thing to make mistakes, it's another to make an offensive mistake. And so the amount of research that you want to do is pretty vital, and you're also going to want to have, I would think, some beta readers, or at least some alpha readers, who represent or are representative of perhaps the faith that you're writing from. I remember while writing The Bargain, the main character is not a believer, and I was at Antioch at the time, and my mentor was not a believer, and so I would submit some of my pages, and he'd go, no, a non-believer would never think this way. This is not what a non-believer would think. He would think like this. It was very helpful for me because I grew up in a Christian home. I don't know if you knew that or not, Pops, but
no, I didn't know that about you.
Yeah, my dad was actually a minister for a number of years, and coincidentally, my mother was a minister's wife. So I kind of had both sides, yeah. So
what are the odds of that happening?
I don't know what cosmic game of chance came up with that role, but here we are. So it was interesting for me to have that check, to have that voice in my head, and eventually, as I got further and further into it, the character became more and more real, and I understood his worldview, because spirituality affects not only our inner selves, but how we perceive everything outside of us. The way we interpret events, current events, politics, family matters, cultural issues, all of that is colored through the lenses of spirituality, whether that's no faith or whether it's Islamic or Christian or Buddhist, etc. It's all colored from those core sets of beliefs that we have. And so it's important that you have somebody read that for you who can call you out on it and say, you know what, I just don't think this is quite accurate. And heaven forbid you should write something that's inadvertently offensive to a particular group of people. You want to make sure that you avoid that. And so before you let anyone else read it, make sure you've got someone in your corner who can read that for you. If you don't know anybody, there's this wonderful tool called Facebook, where you can meet people of all sorts of races and religions who, if you find the right ones, can be very open-minded and willing to read what you have and kind of instruct you in that way.
Yeah, and the ocean of faith is very deep, and there's lots of nuances in it, and it's very easy to make mistakes or make assumptions and be too lazy to check on them. Writing a novel, you're going to make mistakes. It's almost impossible, especially starting out, to get all the facts right. I did a book that had a police forensic detective in it, and I kept talking about blood spatter. Excuse me, blood splatter. It's actually blood spatter, but I didn't even realize I was doing that, and someone called me on it. It's not a big deal and easy to fix, but those kinds of mistakes are going to happen anyway. So you do want to get some of those things correct. And to give an illustration of that, I was watching a show. I almost hate to admit this, but I like all the UFO shows. I'm not really much of a believer in UFOs, but nonetheless, when I was a kid, I loved this stuff, and I'm at an age now where I want to revisit the stuff I loved as a kid. So I tend to watch them quite a bit, and in one of the shows, I don't remember which one, supposedly a UFO had crashed, and there had been an alien aboard, and it was clear that the alien was dying, and they called a local Baptist pastor to come give last rites. And that thing went by, and then it took me a second, and I stopped, and I said, oh, wait a minute. I was a Baptist pastor for 22 years. I never gave last rites. Did I forget to do something? Baptists don't do that. So someplace along the line, they got the information wrong. The guy either wasn't a Baptist preacher, maybe he was Roman Catholic. They're the ones best known for doing last rites. Or someplace along the line, they got it messed up, but there's no one there to catch that. And, of course, I caught it right away because I'm on the inside circle of that. So, and those times when I've had to write about Catholics, I did a book where one of the protagonists was a Jesuit priest, and I had to do a lot of research about the Jesuits and terminology they would use because it would be very different from my background. So it is easy to make a mistake, and you're right. If you can get somebody to go over it and say, no, wait a minute here. It wouldn't be said that way, or they actually don't believe that. You're close, but you're not quite there. Here's actually what Lutherans believe. And sometimes they're just little things. As you know, Aaron, if you go to a Roman Catholic church, you celebrate the Eucharist, but you're not going to celebrate the Eucharist in a Protestant church. They call it Lord's Supper. Even though it's basically the same thing, there's some theology that makes it very different, but though they're basically the same thing, you can't apply the same terms across the board. So it's very easy. And then again, with Rabbi Small, he would do what's known as a straw man argument. He would want to show the superiority of Jewish thinking over Christian thinking, and so he would tell us what Christians thought and then knock that straw man down. And he was wrong I shouldn't say most of the time. He's a good writer, and I've enjoyed the books immensely. But he was often off target with that, and so he's defeating an argument that doesn't exist. So that's what you want to watch out for.
And I would also say on that point, talking about the straw man argument, that one of the drives of a writer is to really to make a point, right? We want to make a point. We're going to write a book that has a particular theme, that has a message that's going to get its point across. Well, the problem with that is if you create a character, this is where we get back into the offensive territory. If you create a character who is giving these straw man arguments, and then you have your champion for your particular cause, knocking them down, well, you're not making the other side look ridiculous or unintelligent. You're actually doing the opposite, because now it shows that you've not done your research and you haven't treated the issue with enough respect. I can't remember who it was that said that one of the beauties of writing is to have two people arguing and to not know what side the author is on, to give both sides valid points. You don't even always have to come to a resolution. Sometimes, if your Christian protagonist is evangelizing to their non-Christian friend, sometimes that non-Christian friend doesn't turn to Christ. Like, it just sometimes doesn't happen, and it's okay for that. It's okay for them to have some good reasons for it. The worst thing imaginable, I think, in context of writing, is to have your characters doing things that are completely outside of what they would normally do. Having the easy conversion scene in Christian fiction seems fake, and trite, and it kind of undercuts the rest of whatever it is that you're working on, the novel, the power that it can have. Instead, you want the conflict to be real and tangible, and you don't want it to be easily resolved. These are things that are at the core of our value. I mean, again, it colors everything that we see. Our entire moral compass is based on these beliefs. And so you want to be aware of that, and you don't want to treat it lightly, and you don't want to treat anybody else's faith lightly, and you don't want to treat the lack of faith lightly. These are all people, and they're intelligent, and they have reasons for believing what they believe. And we need to honor that and respect that, but we also shouldn't be afraid about talking about it and having our characters converse about these types of things.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, some good points there, and there really shouldn't be an element of fear, just really a desire to be accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't want to look foolish as a writer, and then you're losing readers. Now, that doesn't mean that every spiritual person you bring in has to be, the gold standard of morality. They can make mistakes. They don't always start off where they may end up in their spiritual journey. Whatever that spiritual journey might be, there's going to be setbacks. And then sometimes you have people within, and this is true for any faith group that you talk about, you're going to have people on the inside that are just either mean and sometimes just downright evil, and they use the cloak of spirituality to get some of these things done that they do. Jim Jones and stuff like that. You can go that far with it. And the thing is, you're dealing with people. The faith aspect that we're talking about, the spirituality aspect we're talking about, is just to flesh out the character. Now, I one time started a book, and it was going to be a general market book. It wasn't written for the Christian market. And when I got to the end of the book, I kept thinking my character is just too thinly drawn, and I realized I was missing one of the dimensions in it. Turned out a Christian publisher bought it, and the joke is I baptized it and turned it into a Christian book. With that, I felt a little better because I've spent so much time in this life, but I felt a little bit better because I felt my character was now better drawn. Now, that's not to say all the characters in the book were Christians. They're not, by any stretch of the imagination. And she, in that book, really through the whole book, isn't either. She encounters faith, but she doesn't respond to it initially through that. So it really depends who your readers are going to be and what it is you're trying to achieve, but I think the spirituality portion helps flesh out the characters so that they're a little bit more believable, even if they're antagonistic towards faith, even if they're involved in anything like witchcraft, world of magic, whatever it might be. It brings more to their character. And a lot of people don't realize this. Of course, C.S. Lewis is known for his Christian writings. He was very overt about that, though he did a lot of scholarly writings too that he's not remembered for, but the other ones. But Tolkien's books, although not clearly Christian, he was a very profound Catholic, a very devout Catholic. You see some of the concepts getting into the book. The book isn't about Catholicism or Christianity at all, really, but you just see some of the moral principles that he picked up in his Roman Catholicism that have an impact on the book itself. If you didn't know the fact that he had been an ardent Catholic, you might not have realized that initially.
You bring up this idea of morals and morality, and that was another aspect that I wanted to touch on. You said that a lot of times people will use spirituality to do some pretty terrible things, and our sense of morals as people and as our character's sense of morals all stem from our spiritual beliefs. what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is evil. Um, I'm a Christian. I want to follow all the rules, but if I'm doing 56 and a 55, I don't feel like I'm doing anything wrong. If I'm doing 60 and a 55, I don't feel like I'm doing something wrong. But if somebody's doing, 70 and a 55, now I've got a problem with them, and they have some moral issues that they need to deal with, right? The person who would never steal candy from a store, but they're copying their Netflix movies. How do they rationalize that? And what is their sense of where is their moral compass? A lot of people, like you say, do some very bad things for some very good reasons. They believe that it's for the greater good. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, whatever the case may be. But this is the rationalization that is often used by those who we might call misguided, but who are not misguided. What's the old line that every character is a hero of their own story? So when we have these villains, quote unquote villains, or these people that are of a different faith set than our protagonists, you have to understand that they are the hero of their own story. Their moral compass, what they're doing that's so heinous and evil, is not heinous and evil to them, otherwise they wouldn't do it. But they've got a very good reason, and you've got to be able to sell that. Otherwise, you've got these one-dimensional characters who are just placeholders. They're just filling a spot so that your protagonist can do something cool. Instead, you want them, every character has to have a motivation. You've got to show that spiritual motivation for them to make that really come alive. So ask yourself, what is their sense of morals? What does their moral compass look like? What is okay? What isn't okay? And why? And when you can start figuring that out, that'll, I think, make its way into your book and really kind of deepen your characters.
Yeah, I dealt with that in one of my earlier books, where I have a guy who works for an NGO, a non-governmental organization, and he works in the area of world hunger and protecting the innocent. Now, you would think that would be the Christian character. It's not. In fact, the whole point of that was, and I asked this as part of my tagline, how far would you go to save a life? How far would you go to save 100 lives? How far would you go to save 1,000 lives? Would you lie? Would you cheat? Would you kill? And in the book, what I explore is all the bad things, at least the violent things this guy does, but he doesn't do it for personal gain. He does it to protect the innocents who can't protect themselves. And then to mix it up, then the guy who's working with him is a broken-down pastor. His wife left him. He's emotionally bare, and so he becomes a speechwriter initially, and he's traveling to be able to put some of this stuff together, and he has to ask himself, is it right to take the life of the bad guy to protect a bunch of other people? Now, we're quick to give answers, yeah, sure, why not? But I wanted to go deeper into that, and so I explored that in a couple of books with those characters. Terminal Justice and Tarnished Image, yeah.
Two very good books, I might add. Some really complex themes working in there, and it's like you say that it stems from these gray areas, these moral gray areas, trying to conceive of a villain who's doing bad things but for good reasons, or for the hero who does perhaps some bad things that might be questionable in order for the greater good. It's really easy to have, to deal with the black and white issues, but the gray areas are, I think, really fascinating. As a matter of fact, with the bargain, that was one of the driving forces, is that each of the characters, the way I wanted to spin it, is that each of the characters has done something good, and they've also done something bad. Does the good outweigh the bad? Is there really a scale on which people can be judged? Who ultimately decides what is righteous? One of the things it deals with is exactly that. Is it okay to remove evil from the world? If somebody is clearly evil and causing harm and damaging people, is it okay to remove them? It's kind of the death penalty argument in some regard. And that became kind of a fascinating study for me. And I think one of the reasons readers enjoy it is because I kind of go to those dark places, but I also show the light places, and it asks those kind of probing questions. For each character, they have their own moral compass, and what they do is okay in their book. Sometimes they do things they don't believe in, which creates some inner conflict, right? And that's one reason you have that inner struggle. But for the most part, they're all guided by a particular moral compass, and it was really intriguing to figure that out, and then to have, excuse me, my protagonist go on this journey of discovery, to see what everybody else's moral compass looks like, and it kind of makes him reflect on his own. And that's where kind of the spiritual change starts to work within him, is from the influence of all these other people who are not evangelizing him, but are instead simply telling them their stories. And that became kind of a fun thing to play with. With each new character, I got to ask myself, what's the good, what's the bad, what's their moral compass that guided them. You can do some really amazing things with your fiction when you start asking those types of questions.
Yeah, and then of course, and especially in literary fiction, but you can certainly do it in popular fiction. You can delve into those things about whether or not your moral compass is dependable. How do you know it's pointing to true north? How do you know that you're not skewing it, or your character's not skewing it somehow? Uh, if a magnet will pull a compass off course, what pulls you off course? Your character off course. Uh, and that's when you get into the deep portions of the person. You can start with that morality that we all have. We all have some form of morality. Often we want to deny what that morality is, but nonetheless, it's innate in us. You can see it, that there's a sense of right and wrong that has to come from somewhere. All right, so you're getting into that, but then how does that affect the person? Is the person so guilt-ridden that it affects his or her health, so it affects the physical? Are they emotional basket case, or are they stronger for it, willing to die for something? You don't know, but you're getting into the mental and into the emotional aspect. So it really, I think, pulls the other aspects of being a human together, having some kind of spiritual aspect to it all, and to keep it from just being a stew that's boiling on the pot, but making it into a meal.
Nice, yeah. I like that a magnet can pull a compass off track, and what is going to pull your character off track. One of the things, where does internal conflict arise? You could write about a serial killer who's murdering, 20 people, 25 people, and never violating their moral compass. They think it's fine. There's no internal conflict in that story at all, because they are aligned with their personal beliefs. What's more interesting is when people do things that violate their personal moral compass, kind of like what you were talking about. What is it that pulls them away? When you can identify that too, that's going to deepen your characters, because some people would never do X, but they're really kind of tempted by Y. They're fascinated by it. They know it's wrong, but they can't stop looking at it and kind of moving toward that direction, even though they know it's wrong. And so there's that internal conflict for them, because it's wrong for them. They believe it's wrong for them to do that, but they still have that desire and that particular urge. And that could take a variety of shapes. If you think of Dimsdale in The Scarlet Letter, and he's a minister who's had an affair, and he doesn't tell anybody, and the guilt, like you say, is just racking him and making him physically ill. It's exactly as you've described. And then, of course, you get Chillingworth, who is like the sleaziest of all people on the planet, who has no internal conflict at all, but he is constantly tormenting this poor minister. And then you've got, on the other side, you have Hester Prynne, who is, repentant, but she's not racked by guilt. She's genuinely feels bad for what she did, but it's not completely destroying. She's not letting it destroy her character within her. So there's some really interesting stuff here. If you want to talk about the spirituality of your characters, The Scarlet Letter is still a really good study. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but it does, have some fantastically drawn characters in this regard.
Yes, and you can go the other direction, like C.S. Lewis did with his science fiction and some of his other fantasy types of works. All of them small, but his overriding goal for writing that was to get a Christian message across, and he makes it very clear. There's no hiding it. Now, that's why he's doing that, and it's so you have all the symbolism that he as a professor of medieval literature would know very well, and mythology and stuff, but he gives it a Christian twist. So when you see that, you you see that he has an agenda. But now you may have another story. I'm thinking of Harry Potter, for example, where you have people that have a moral compass are doing things because it needs to be done, because it's the right thing to be done, because others will suffer if they don't do it, or sometimes it's for self-preservation. But it's an entirely different world setup than, say, what C.S. Lewis would have done with that. So now there's been some debate as to whether or not the Harry Potter has a Christian message to it or not. I don't know that it does, but sometimes we like to adopt those things and bring them in. I'm not sure that it does, but nonetheless, what you see is a spiritual side. In the Harry Potter thing now, it would be, well, it's wizards, it's magic. That is the spiritual side of things. Star Wars had a spiritual side. They called it the Force. It was an impersonal God, not a God that had a person. That is intellect, emotion, and will. That's what personhood is. Intellect, I think. Emotion, I feel. Will, I make decisions and act on those decisions. But nonetheless, there was still that spiritual element throughout the Star Wars.
And I think you could argue the case that it is this concept of the Force that really set Star Wars apart from all the other science fiction out there, and then we get the space opera, and really what you have is a fantasy set in deep space, and that's fine. But what most fascinated people, I think, with that was this Jedi Order and the light side and the dark side, and this spiritual aspect. Even though we've got lightsabers, even though we've got laser guns, we still have another force at play, a spiritual force, which they simply called the Force. But I think that when we're talking about spirituality in fiction, we need to remember that as well. It's not just in our characters. We can talk about, excuse me, there's a fly that is just in love with me today and cannot stop hanging out. It's on my shoulder right now. Hello, Mr. Fly. That's going to be very distracting, and I apologize in advance.
Well, get him a microphone.
We're gonna go viral on YouTube. I'm gonna just freak out and flip the desk and start throwing things, and man loses mind on YouTube. So,
and that ends this show.
Right. Tune in next week when I'm committed. Can you see it on the video there?
I can. I can see it. Yeah.
It's just wants to be on camera. That's all there is to it.
Yeah,
so
that time of year, California.
Wants its wings to be heard. So, okay. Anyhow, back to my point. So there's a force, a spiritual force, and we can also have that in our writing. And it's important to play it properly, because it's very easy when you want to have a spiritual force in your story, even if it's something as simple as answered prayers, divine intervention. It's very easy to tread into the area of Deus Ex Machina. And there's a definite line there. And I think for our purposes, and Pops, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but for our purposes, for me, divine intervention is anything that resolves a conflict that the characters are not actively involved in. So, the aliens abduct the bad guy at just the right moment. The Panther jumps out of nowhere to eat the villain's face before she can shoot the good guy. Those types of things that are not, they seem unbelievable because they're too coincidental to happen, and the protagonist doesn't necessarily play any sort of role in it. And I think that's where Deus Ex Machina really kind of breaks the story, and why readers are so generally unsatisfied by it. But that's not to say that you can't have something like the Force that intervenes in some way, perhaps as a result of divine intervention or answered prayer, to have a kind of an unseen, invisible force that is also exerting its will on the events of your story. It can also deepen your story as well.
Yeah, and we're often taught that now. We get a way in spiritual markets like the Christian market, the CBA, excuse me, in the CBA, we can use a little bit of that, but even so, we don't do the Deus Ex Machina, the machine of God, to come in and save the day. The general rule of thumb is your protagonist must solve it. Now, I want to be a little careful with it. It's especially bad in television. I don't know if we have anybody writing television. I watched an episode last night of Scorpion, this team of geniuses, and in every episode, the primary lead must be the one who does the ultimate saving, even if there's another one of his guys there who can do it and is in a better position to do it. He has to come in and do that, and that's really going too far. you can allow for those things. But I wanted to touch on something else, if I may, Aaron, about spirituality in writing, and that is that uh, faith stories. I'm most familiar with the Christian ones, but there's many faith stories have and can be used as the basic outline for other fiction. And a lot of people don't realize this, but this goes on all the time. And one of the clearest ones, and I dare say most people don't realize this, but is Poseidon Adventure, which is a Christ story. And if you know that going in, you can see all the little symbolism. So it's not just a terror story, a disaster story where a cruise ship is turned upside down. But if you follow it through, you see that it really is a Christ story. And so what you have is Gene Hackman playing a priest who's leading a small band of followers, just like Christ had his disciples, up the angled portion of the ship. The ship is bowed down in the water, and the stern is up, and he thinks that's the best way to go. But the crew, the captain and some of the others say, no, we have to go down here for this reason. And so it's just a few people who will follow him. And so, in essence, he is the Savior, the Messiah that is leading them to their safety. And you see event after event after event. Each of his disciples, many of them die off. And in the end, he has to sacrifice himself. And the way he does it is he has to turn a big wheel that opens a valve or a vent. And he's hanging on this thing, turning it. And he says, God, if you don't want to help me, at least don't fight me. Which is a takeoff of the Psalm 22, Old Testament psalm that Jesus repeats from the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And so he's doing that, and then to be able to get it to work, he dies, and he has therefore sacrificed himself for the believers. Now, if you don't know that going in, you miss that. But if you have that basic storyline, you can see what the writers were doing. Now, you can use other faith-based stories too, and that has been done in movies, television, and in books also, and serves as a great outline because it deals with all the big subjects that people have to deal with.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. Obviously the C.S. Lewis, the Chronicles of Narnia, far more perhaps overt in some of their symbolism, in Aslan the Lion of Judah, and giving himself up, and then of course resurrected. And all of that kind of stuff. So there's a ton of symbolism that goes through there, and that's far less obscure, if you will, or it's a lot more overt. We can at least say, which can be fun, as long as I know a lot of readers don't like kind of the preachy kinds of messages. So you can do something like Poseidon. You can also draw inspiration from biblical stories. In some regard, the bargain is a take on Sodom and Gomorrah, kind of a modern day Sodom and Gomorrah. The tale of Noah's Ark, we've seen things like that kind of done before, taking different shapes, and the spaceship that leaves Earth before it's destroyed, and those types of things in science fiction. So you see those a lot, but you can pull those from any faith that has these holy scriptures. There's a lot of stuff that you can kind of mine and adapt and use as a basic story structure for your fiction as well. So there's a lot of wealth. There's a wealth of stuff that you can do there. Never any shortage of inspiration from those texts.
Yeah, or any faith-based story, since we're talking in general terms, and there's really a great many of them. Indian culture, but I mean East India, has a really rich mythology that could serve as story, especially in fantasy. They have a very rich mythology that you could follow. So a lot of stories that we read are Christ stories, or they're spin-offs of other faith-based stories, but they're given a new face. Just the basic plot points are the same. And the same goal, in essence.
And you've got the Rick Riordan series where he's done Egyptian mythology, Greek mythology, Roman mythology, kind of putting a new face on some of those old stories and making them a little more modern and accessible to kind of younger readers. My son has, I think, read almost all of them. I think there's like 2 more books he hasn't read, but he's just devouring those and loving them. And there's this I think innate kind of we all have a spiritual side, even though even atheists have a spiritual side, like we've kind of said before. Um, but there's that particular itch within us that likes to be, to read fiction that scratches that particular spiritual itch and talks about those things. So you can see angels in your fiction, and you can see demons, or you can see, Roman deities or mythological deities and stuff like that. If you want to be, if you want to kind of involve them in that, and have kind of that man versus God kind of a conflict, but it doesn't always have to be that overt. I think of one of my favorite short stories of all time by Flannery O'Connor. Shout out to her. Um, the Life You Save May Be Your Own. And if you've not had a chance to read it, try and find it somewhere. It's fantastic. I cannot recommend it highly enough, especially when talking about the spiritual side of characters. You've got this grifter, he's a drifting grifter, if you will, and kind of a con man. And when he first shows up on the scene, he looks back at the countryside before him and stretches out his arm, but one is shorter than the other, so he looks like a broken cross. So you immediately, from the first time you meet this guy, that image of looking like a broken cross, you go, this guy's off kilter. His sense of morality is not what we would term, consistent with the norm, if you will. And he starts going on and on and on about all the evil people on Earth. What you come to find out is he thinks he's good, but he clearly is not good, and he is involved in some shenanigans. But it's a fantastic read. Highly recommended. So that's your homework. I'm going to give you guys homework. Your homework tonight: go find The Life You Save May Be Your Own by Flannery O'Connor and read it by any means necessary. Google it. I'm sure it'll pop up for you. Some fantastic stuff there.
I was just thinking that the old television show Kung Fu is very loosely based on some Asian moral thinking and belief system with that. Now, I say loosely based because it received some criticism for being a little off kilter on some things, but you see what the writers did is they started with that idea and then they made it their own. And so it was somewhat familiar, but at the same time very different. So there's just a wealth of that. And this old, let me back up. Religious literature is just filled with story. Just filled with story. And you can take almost, the Bible, for example, is just tons and tons and tons of story. And you can take almost any one of them and find a moral aspect to it and make a story out of it in a contemporary setting. It has been done. I'm thinking of the book Job. Just in case for those who don't understand or don't know the story of Job. Job was an Old Testament man who lost everything, lost his family. They were all killed, lost all his riches, lost all his animals, and all he was left with was a nagging wife and friends who couldn't give any good advice, even though they tried. With that, his wife's suggestion is curse God and die, and so he wasn't just getting a lot of support in all of that. Well, someone made that into a stage play called Job, but instead it was a high-end executive that begins to lose everything. And I remember being in junior high school, and we were listening to it on long play records. Yeah, I'm that old. And so the teacher would play it, and you'd listen to this play that was really the story of Job. At that time, I'd never been to church, so I didn't know what it was. But it was explained to me that it was from a biblical story, an Old Testament story. And it made a great story in a contemporary setting. I mean, that could be done again.
Well, this was on a long play record, and you're saying it's in a contemporary setting?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, a long play record, is that kind of like a really big CD? I don't know what a long play record is.
Yeah, think of a CD about the size of a Frisbee.
Okay. Do those have one side or two sides?
Oh, those have two sides.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's like...
Actually, it's twice for the money that you spend. You can play both the A side and the B side.
So it's like a laser disc?
Knucklehead.
It's kind of like a laser disc? Is that, the size of a laser disc?
Yeah, but couldn't hold as much information.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am. I'm ancient, so I remember that. I remember the days before there were cassette players. I had an 8-track in the car, so come on. And I thought that was high end.
It was at one point. So Yeah, times they do change. They do change.
Yeah.
We are running. Speaking of time, notice that transition. We are rapidly running out of time. Might take a quick look here if this fly allows me to look at some of our comments here. Uh, Molly Joe says that, let's see, she likes the point about people arguing without revealing the author's preference for the side. She didn't know Tolkien was a Catholic. She asks if that makes her a bad reader. I say no, I don't think it makes her a bad reader at all. Makes, I think, Tolkien a good writer, if anything there.
Yeah, it wasn't his point to promote Catholicism. You can just every book reflects the author to some degree, which terrifies me because of some of the things I've written. But nonetheless, it reflects something about the author, and and just going through an edit on a small project, I could with the other writers that are involved, I can tell a lot about them by the editorial comments they make.
Hmm.
There are people who are not just in this group, but I've encountered this through my career, that are afraid of emotion, so they like you to take out as much emotion as possible, keep it to the side because it makes them uncomfortable to see emotion. Then there are others that want you to put emotion in it because there's not enough emotion. So it will reveal something about the writer.
Absolutely, it does. Yeah. Uh, this fly is trying to land on my nose. That's fantastic. Bethany Kazmarek says that she likes exploring the moral gray areas with her characters. She also points out that Stephen James does that powerfully with the Patrick Bowers series. He wonders how far he'd go to stop a sociopathic serial killer, and when justice vengeance deeply satisfies him, when the killer's suffering satisfies him, he wonders what keeps him from becoming evil himself. So, absolutely some good stuff there. Some good moral ground covered there. And Molly Joe also mentions the movie Perfume, says there's a lot of moral conflict there. The protagonist is so well portrayed, you only have compassion for him, it says. So thank you all for listening and weighing in, and we're pretty much out of time. So, Pops, how can people get a hold of you?
Well, as usual, just go to the website, altongansky.com, and you can pretty much bridge to anything from there. So that's it. I am on the Twittinator. So you can find me at Alton Gansky, Google Plus, Facebook, all the social media.
Excellent. And I am, of course, always at aarongansky.com and on the Book of Faces and the Tweeter. So if ever you feel like tweeting me or dropping me a line on Facebook, you can find me there or at aarongansky.com. So we thank you all for listening. And until next week, good writing.